Rick never liked to close his small shop before midnight. He always said real engines speak clearer when the town goes quiet, and that night was no different. The old flickering sign outside buzzed with the letters barely holding together, Rick's Honest Repairs. Inside, the concrete floor was cold under his boots, the smell of oil and old leather filling the cramped single-bay garage. Tools sat scattered along an ancient wooden bench beside an old coffee maker, sputtering out its last drop. Rick was tired but too stubborn to admit it, wiping black grease off his hands with a rag older than him. He just switched off the old radio when he heard a faint knock on the foggy glass door. It was late, too late for customers, but the shape on the other side wasn't a customer in any usual sense. Rick squinted through the dusted window and saw a small girl, no older than 16, bracing herself on metal crutches, her eyes searching for courage behind a shy, uncertain smile. Behind her idled a beat-up blue Mustang, coughing out white puffs into the cold air. Rick pulled the door open, shivering at the chill. The girl's name was Emma. She had a soft voice, but her words carried the weight of someone who'd had to grow up too fast. She explained that the Mustang used to be her dad's pride. He'd promised to teach her to drive it one day, but a sudden accident had stolen that promise. The car had been rotting in their driveway for years, while Emma's own legs healed slowly with metal rods and doctors' warnings that hope costs extra. Now she wanted it running again. She didn't say it, but Rick knew she needed more than a car. Rick's eyes drifted over the Mustang. He saw the rust crawling around the fenders, the cracked side mirrors, the tailpipe trembling like it was scared to breathe. He'd seen worse, but this car was more than metal. It was her memory, her fight to stand taller than the world's pity. He didn't know what to charge her. He couldn't charge her. So he just nodded and gestured for her to roll it inside. Emma's smile flickered to life, and Rick felt warmth creep into the cold corners of his shop. As the Mustang creaked into the bay, Emma balanced on her crutches, her breath fogging the glass as she watched Rick work. He popped the hood, wincing at the tangled mess inside. "Gonna take some time," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Emma didn't complain. She just watched him with a quiet fire in her eyes, like she believed he was the only man alive who could keep a promise made by a ghost. Rick didn't say much, but when she handed him tools with her thin hands, he felt an old pride reawaken. Hours blurred into the early morning. The radio mumbled old country songs, while Rick's hands danced across corroded pipes and snapped belts. He scavenged spare parts from old engines stacked behind the shop. He found an old alternator that needed love, but would hold just long enough. Every bolt he tightened reminded him why he stayed in this falling-down building when the world told him to retire. Machines didn't lie, they didn't beg or threaten. They just waited for someone patient enough to listen. Emma sat in the small metal chair in the corner office, curled under a patched blanket Rick kept for lonely nights. Every so often, he'd catch her eyes blinking open as he hammered out a bent panel or checked the oil. She never asked how long it would take, she just trusted him. And Rick realized that trust weighed heavier than money in that tiny shop. By dawn, his back screamed and his knuckles bled, but the Mustang's heart began to beat again. The old engine shuddered, coughed, then found its rhythm. Rick tapped the hood proudly and called Emma over. She limped closer, her eyes wide as the Mustang rumbled, steady and warm. She reached out, fingers trembling, and touched the cold metal as if it were her father's shoulder. When Rick offered her the keys, she stared at them like they were made of gold. "I can't pay you," she whispered, her voice cracking under the gratitude she couldn't contain. Rick just shook his head, chuckling as he wiped sweat from his brow with the same rag. "Some debts aren't paid in dollars, kid," he said softly. "You just promise me you'll take it slow when you get behind that wheel." Emma nodded, blinking back tears that made Rick suddenly clear his throat and pretend to check the oil again. She slid into the torn leather seat, her crutches propped against the dashboard. The engine's soft purr filled the silence between them, and for a moment Rick felt like he'd done something right in a world that rarely felt fair. Emma's mom pulled up just as dawn broke through the cracked shop windows. She stepped out, her face a mixture of exhaustion and relief, when she saw her daughter beaming behind the wheel. Rick stayed back, hands shoved in greasy pockets, watching the reunion through the drifting exhaust. He didn't want thanks. He wanted to remember that look on Emma's face forever. Her mom tried to offer him money, but he raised his hand, cutting her off before she could finish. "Take her home," he said gruffly, "and drive safe." When the Mustang rolled off the lot, coughing out a final puff of blue smoke before disappearing around the corner, Rick stood alone in the open bay, the rising sun casting long shadows on the stained concrete floor. He was bone-tired, hungry, and behind on bills, but his heart felt like it was finally in the black. He shuffled back inside, flicked off the radio, and let the old sign flicker out one letter at a time. For a brief second, the buzzing neon read Rick's Honest Repair, singular, like it knew this night would stay with him forever. Rick didn't expect anything in return. He'd spent his life fixing broken things, and sometimes those things fixed him back in ways he never said out loud. He locked up the shop and walked home with oil on his sleeves and a spark in his chest he hadn't felt since his own boy was Emma's age. He didn't see the future waiting around the corner, didn't know that sometimes a favor spins the world right when you least expect it. He just knew he'd do it again tomorrow if the chance came knocking. Rick didn't sleep much after Emma drove away in that old Mustang. He dozed off in his chair by the window for maybe an hour before the sun rose high enough to spill golden light through the blinds. He rubbed his aching back, sipped cold coffee from a chipped mug, and wondered if Emma would be careful. He pictured her tiny hands on the steering wheel, her mother in the passenger seat, holding her breath at every stop sign. Rick smiled to himself. Some things were worth the bruised knuckles and the unpaid invoices that piled up every month. By noon, Rick was back at his shop, rummaging through old parts, pretending he didn't hear his stomach growl. The Mustang was gone, but its scent of old leather lingered, reminding him why he never sold out when the big chain garages moved in down the street. His phone buzzed on the counter, an old flip phone that barely held a charge. No one ever called except for the electric company or his brother's wife trying to check on him. But today it rang twice, an unknown number flashing on the cracked screen. Rick frowned, wiped his hands, and flipped it open. The voice on the other end was polite, almost too polished for his dusty world. A woman asked if he could spare a few minutes to talk. He assumed it was a telemarketer ready to hang up, but the woman asked for him by name. She said her name was Lauren Kane. Rick squinted at the Mustang's oil stain on the floor. Emma's mother, but the voice sounded stronger, sharper than the quiet woman he'd seen last night. Before he could ask more, the woman asked if she could stop by the shop. She said she had something important for him. Rick didn't know what to expect when the big black SUV rolled up to his battered lot an hour later. The shiny hood reflected the sun like a mirror, making his old sign look even rustier by comparison. He wiped his hands on his rag, tried to flatten his hair in the glass door, but gave up when the back door of the SUV opened and Lauren Kane stepped out. She looked different than the tired mother who'd thanked him last night. Today, she wore a navy blazer and a calm power in her eyes that made Rick feel like a kid again. Lauren didn't waste time on pleasantries. She stepped into the garage and looked around at the old parts, the stacked tires, the calendar on the wall stuck 3 months behind. She smiled when she saw Rick's confusion. "I didn't properly introduce myself last night," she said softly. "I'm Emma's mother, but I'm also CEO of Kane Enterprises." Rick blinked. He'd heard the name, a real estate empire, half the city's skyline carrying her company's mark. She looked at him like she was seeing something no one else did. He shifted his boots, uncomfortable in the spotlight of her gaze. Lauren walked over to the workbench and ran her fingers over the old tools. She asked him how long he'd owned the place. Rick shrugged. "Too long," he said with a dry chuckle. She smiled again, but her eyes didn't. She told him that Emma had come home last night and talked about the car the whole evening. How she sat behind the wheel long after the engine turned off. How she told her mother that Rick didn't ask for a single dollar. "You didn't have to do that," Lauren said, her voice softer than her suit made her look. Rick shifted again, mumbling something about how Emma reminded him of someone he'd once known. He didn't explain further, Some ghosts stay where they belong. Lauren reached into her leather bag and pulled out a crisp envelope. She held it out like a peace offering. Rick hesitated, wiping his hands again, even though the grease never fully came off. When he finally opened it, his eyes widened at the check inside. More zeros than he'd seen on paper in his life. "I can't take this," he whispered, his throat tight. Lauren held up a hand before he could protest. "It's not charity, Mr. Rick," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. She gestured at the rusty Mustang oil stain. "I want to hire you." Rick's laugh burst out before he could swallow it. "Hire me? Lady, I fix old engines and drink cheap coffee. I'm nobody's employee." But Lauren only smiled like she'd expected his stubbornness. She explained how her company was launching a new foundation, one focused on helping kids with disabilities gain independence. She wanted Rick to lead a new program, rebuilding cars and machines that help kids move, drive, even dream bigger. Rick stared at her like she'd just offered him a spaceship to the moon. He glanced at his cluttered garage, the walls that leaked when it rained, the heater that hadn't worked in 2 winters. He thought of Emma's face when the Mustang rumbled back to life. He thought of the kids who'd never taste that freedom because no one bothered to fix what they needed. For a long minute, the old mechanic didn't say a word. Then he met Lauren's eyes and saw the same fire he'd glimpsed in Emma's shy smile. Maybe this was something he couldn't fix alone. Lauren didn't push him for an answer. She left him the folder with her card tucked inside. Before she stepped back into her polished SUV, she turned at the door and thanked him again for giving her daughter a piece of her father back. Rick watched the SUV disappear down the cracked road, the sun catching the shiny bumper like a promise he hadn't dared dream. He closed the shop early that day, the check still sitting untouched on the bench while he made himself another cup of stale coffee and stared at the empty space where the Mustang had sat. That night, Rick didn't sleep at all. He sat in the same chair by the window, flipping through old photos of his son, who'd once dreamed of building cars that changed people's lives. He remembered how his boy's hands looked small, holding a wrench for the first time. He thought about the kids who'd never stand behind a wheel, kids who only needed someone to believe a machine could do what doctors sometimes couldn't. When dawn broke again, Rick stood, stretched his aching back, and knew what he'd say when Lauren Kane called him next. The new shop opened 3 months later on the other side of town, sunlight pouring through huge glass windows that made Rick's old sign feel like a relic from another life. The place smelled of fresh paint and oil. A good combination, Rick always said. There were new lifts, new benches, and most importantly, kids lined up with broken wheelchairs, old scooters, and tired eyes full of hope. Emma came by every weekend, driving that same old Mustang, her braces folded on the passenger seat while she helped Rick teach other kids to dream of open roads. People came and went through the new shop. Doctors, engineers, kids with bandaged legs and wide eyes. Some days, Rick still wore his old boots and the same oil-smeared cap. Some habits didn't break, no matter how bright the lights or clean the walls. He watched Emma laugh with a boy whose wheelchair got a new motor. He watched Lauren stand beside him in the corner office she'd built for him, a place he never used because his hands still needed grease to feel useful. Some nights he'd walk the new floors and breathe in the hum of possibility. Rick never touched that first check. He framed it, hung it behind the register next to the dusty picture of his son. He told people it reminded him where all of this started, with a girl, a rusty Mustang, and a promise that some debts are never paid in cash. When he locked up at night, he looked at the row of kids waiting to roll out in their fixed machines and thought maybe, just maybe, he'd finally fix something that would never break again. And when the lights went off, the shop hummed like an engine reborn.